Hey, good. Aloha class. I hope it's either morning or evening to you. This is lecture 4.2. 4.1, we did a live lecture on it, and hopefully you've seen the video. 4.2 is actually something that probably you already know. So we're just recording it just in case you do know how to do this and you want to learn more, watch the video. Today we're going to teach you on how to outline or diagram or build your lecture notes, sermon notes, or materials. Uh, Remember, the more you do this skill, the better you become. All right. So there is no easy way of doing this. Everything is hard work. So let me share my screen to you. So where do we start in our lesson? So why do we outline in the first place? Well, we outline in so many ways. You gotta know and understand that we all think best. So where do we start? Well, we start by thinking about our students. And our students, we want to let them think with organization. We wanna we wanna help them come alongside with us in the way we're going to tackle our subject. You got to remember that every person thinks logically. And because everybody thinks in sequence or with connections, it will be better that when you speak, you arrange your material properly. In the first place, when you're proving a point, you want to create a reasonable argument or arrangement. So make sure they're building or make sure they're connected, make sure they're following a story, or if you're just about to teach them on commands or imperatives, tell them why they should be doing this. And so all of those are arranged. Grady Davis says a structure, the one that we're building on, is an expression of the basic thought. And that's why it's very important at the very beginning of your lesson to always have a sermon idea or a lesson idea, because that's the one that's going to give you the premise and the boundary on which to build on. Okay, so what is our goal for this skill? Well, first, make sure that before you divide your outline, before you divide your material, you have a clear subject. Ask the question, what is the writer talking about this passage? Okay, if it's a story, what is the story being emphasized on? If it is a story of a big picture, what part of the picture is this? The next thing is, after you thought about the main idea, you want to ask, so how does the writer build on this? So ask some modifiers. Is the writer trying to explain? And if so, how is he explaining it? Is the writer talking about,
I didn't understand that.
and excuse my phone, is the writer talking about love? In what way is love expressed on this? On narratives, is it talking about a certain direction on the story? You can probably divide the stories into different segments. Today, we'll be looking at Genesis 22. And so that would be one story that we will be working on. The third thing you want to do is after you've outlined them, after you've gotten your point, and then you build your structure, now you want to put some descriptive statements. Descriptive statement simply is a one statement, and you've done this, one statement that describes what that structure is all about. So just one liner, okay? And sometimes those could be a statement that follows alliteration. Sometimes it's a statement that builds upon on each other. For example, if you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, you would say love. And what is love? According to the Apostle Paul, uh, love is kind. Love does not keep records of wrongs. Love is gentle. And you notice how we build upon the main idea of love. All right, let's move on. So there are a few steps I'd like you to practice on this lesson. First one is I want you to determine the rhetorical function. Remember, in lesson number 2, we talked about rhetorical function. In other words, in the whole premise of the writer, is he trying to explain something? Is he trying to illustrate something? Or is he trying to make a point or trying to bring some arguments as to why or what or who? Or is it an imperative? Is there an application to this? Is he commanding? So you need to find out what your rhetorical function is as a whole. And the reason you do that is because when you find it as a whole, you'll probably find some of these outlines and some of these subsets on this main rhetorical function. So that's why it's very important to figure out which one. Now, not all the time you'll find all the descriptions under that one column. Most of the time it'll be spread all over the place, but still, nonetheless, build your case. Number 2, here's what I need you to do. I need you to identify ideas on how the writer is explaining his point. So once you've figured out your rhetoric functions, you're going to help identify what is the writer trying to say about this idea. So you've got all of these main point, you determined what direction you're going to go to. Now you're going to try to break it down. How is the subject being modified under these 10 verses? Okay. And if the Lord is talking about prayer, and in what sense is prayer being explained here? And so you describe that. And that's what number 2 is all about. Just breaking it down into smaller pieces, looking at the whole passage and then breaking it down into small pieces. By step number 1, you've made your own preliminary diagram. You've guessed because you've read, you've looked at subjunctives, you've looked at the connections of each paragraphs in these 10 verses. So you've made your preliminary diagram. By the time you get to number 2, you've gotten a bigger understanding of the clauses and the rhetorical functions and what the statements is all about. Now you have to re-examine, point number 3, you have to re-examine your structural diagram. Did your structural diagram come close? Do we need to change? Now, the reason why we want to do a preliminary diagram is because you're trying to organize it with your mind first. We're giving your mind a chance to calm down and figure out some basic things. And it's pretty much how you do things with life. You know, when you cook, sometimes you make a list and you write down everything. By the time you get to the kitchen and you probably bought the materials, you go, oh, wait, I am missing something. And so you either add or you either go buy, right? So even though you've laid it out, there are some missing things. Of course, that's where your creativeness comes in. And that's what point number 3 is all about. You're now laid out everything. You've seen the main point, your direction, you've laid out everything. Now you want to examine, okay, is this the way how I want to build this by what I have discovered? So we're going to give you some example. Here's one example in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. The Bible tells us, praise be to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that could never perish, spoil, or fade. And then he describes further, this inheritance is kept in you in heaven. And then he furthers on to verse 5. We'll stop there. Okay, because immediately you go, okay, well, Paul is rejoicing, right? And so if I'm going to make my preliminary outline here, I'm going to say my main point is Paul is rejoicing. And what is he rejoicing on? And then I'll have a subpoint. He's rejoicing on God's mercy. And what about God's mercy? Because out of God's mercy, He's given us new birth. All right. And then what do? Well, under that new birth will turn into a living hope. And you've noticed I have subsets under new birth and into that living hope. Oops, hang on. So we have our preliminary diagrams, and it probably will look like this. right? Praise be to God our Father and of our Lord Jesus Christ. And you notice I put all of that under the praise be to, well, God the Father Trinitarian formula. So I just had to put that there. And then under this praises where God is exalted, it says that God in his mercy, so the mercy of Christ, the mercy of the Father, and that's the reason why we're praising, because of God's mercy. Well, what came about under God's mercy? What came about is new birth, right? And I would probably put the new birth there. In this new birth, we have some descriptives. In this new birth, there's a living hope. In this new birth happened because of the resurrection. In this new birth, it's resulting into an inheritance. All right, so that's a preliminary outline. Okay, now I'm going to look at it a lot more deeply, and we're going to try to determine the main point. Is the main point here Paul is just simply rejoicing? Or is the main point here Paul is under emphasizing? How would you know? You would know by the prior verses and the prior and the succeeding verses. And in the succeeding verses of verse 4, 5, and 6, which is not on the screen, you will find out that Paul is not just describing the praise, he's describing something else, which is he's describing the new birth. So immediately you go, well, the main point then is the new birth, because that's what's being described in verse 4, 5, and 6. And if you go back to verse 3, really that's the reason why he's rejoicing. He's not just rejoicing for the mercy, he's rejoicing for the new birth that was brought by God's mercy. So if I'm gonna redo the outline, I'm gonna have to look for the modifiers. What's modifying the new birth? Well, first, great mercy. Great mercy is modifying the new birth. New birth is also living into the preposition. And then another preposition of the through the resurrection. And then verse 4, another into, right? So if I were to look at my outline, it's going to look like this. Praise be to God the Father because of this new birth. And in this new birth, God gave it to us because of his mercy, which results into living hope, which is possible through the resurrection, which will forever be an inheritance for us. So now I've kind of simplified, because there's my main subject. Now I've seen the modifiers, and the modifiers are on top of it, and then the succeeding at the bottom. What's my next step? Well, I just got to look at my rhetorical functions and to see where they fit. First, in his great mercy, he has given us new birth. In other words, by the mercy of God, we have new birth. What is that? That's the basis of our new birth. Now, you might fall into other descriptions here, but the basis of new birth is God's mercy. Into a living hope, that's definitely a result. New birth results into, and what makes you think it's a result? Because of that preposition into, which we will see it again later on in the later point. But if you look at the second part of verse 3, it says through the resurrection. In other words, this is on the basis or the means of that the very reason why we had new birth is because the agency is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And you notice that I kind of use the word explanatory there rather than argumentative, because in the same way, really that's what Paul is trying to say. He's trying to state a notion. It's trying to state a point. And finally, another into, which tells me this is another result, that the new birth results into an eternal inheritance that will never spoil or never perish. So that's my working of the new diagram, and then I put it in some rhetorical functions. I'll just put that on the next point, and now I'm ready to write my statement. So if I'm going to write my statement, I'm going to borrow the basis, the result, and the means, and then the result, and I'm going to make some statements. So statement number 1, that the new birth is because of God's mercy. Number 2, that the new birth will result into living hope. It's not dead, it's alive. That the new birth was possible through Jesus and his death. And number 4, that the eternal result of this will be it will never perish and spoil because it is an inheritance. Hope you see that, but we'll look at it in a bigger scale, okay? Because there are many ways on how to write this outline, and that's where we come in right now. We want to know how to write outlines, and there are four kinds of outlines that you could write on a lesson, okay, depending on what you want to emphasize. First is the historical or narrative outline. If you're following a story, you can divide it up from beginning, middle, and end, and they're all building up to the point. Whatever your main idea is, if the main idea is love, then the beginning point would be the boy discovers love with a girl. The boy pursues deeper love with a girl. And then point number three, the boy continues his love towards the girl. Notice it's all the love, but it's built up in 3 points. That's historical. And there may be a story that's following that. Genesis chapter 22 is a very good story here. And if you look at the Bible, Genesis chapter 22 talks about how God tells Abraham to offer his son Isaac uh, as a sacrifice. And you notice that in this story, and I'm just going to run through it and just follow my cursor. From verse 22, God commands Abraham, and Abraham early the next day obeyed by waking up and by going to the place of God. And then he took the wood. But then there was a conversation that Isaac spurred, and then the faith was challenged here at this time, where Abraham's faith is being questioned by his son, but he said, God will provide. So they hurried on and they moved on. They pursued on. And Abraham's faith was so solid that they moved on. As he was about to take his son's life, an angel intervened. And when the angel intervened, verse 12, conversations went on, and God provided a new sacrifice, a replacement sacrifice, so that he would not give his son. And by this, they celebrated, starting in verse 15. All right. And that was a celebration. I took out verse 20 because it's not related to the topic. So if I were to outline this, the main idea is really Abraham's faith. NIV says Abraham was tested. Well, what in Abraham is tested? His faith. So that could be the main point here. And immediately I see, because it's historical narrative, I see 6 things: the beginning, the actuation, the questioning, and the persistence, and then God's provision, 12, and then the celebration, verse 15. So if I were to outline it, it's going to come like this. In number 1, I would say, in his faith, Abraham was open to God's voice. Starting in verse 3, in his faith, Abraham determined to obey God completely. And then in verse 6, I would say Abraham made whatever sacrifice God required, despite of the question of the son. And in verse 4, and then in verse 7, I would say in his faith, Abraham expected God to meet his everyday need. He told his son God will provide, right? And then on starting in verse 12, I'll probably put and say in his faith, Abraham remained alert because God gave him further instructions. And then in verse 15, we have Abraham here who celebrated his faith because God provided a new sacrifice and he passed. He passed. His faith passed. So now we've got 6 things. So if I put it together, it's going to look like this. And if I'm simply telling a story to emphasize Abraham's point, I will outline it this way. But there's another way to outline this. We call this the proposition outline. That instead of just looking at the past tense, you can actually make this a present tense. And that could relate to your students. And here's how it's going to look like. I would say daring faith is open to the voice of God. And no, immediately I already dropped Abraham there, and I used faith as my point. Daring faith determines to obey God completely. In verse 3, daring faith makes whatever sacrifice God requires. And then daring faith expects God to meet everyday need. Daring faith remains alert for further instructions, and daring faith celebrates God's faithfulness. And you notice how it's kind of related, right? But instead of Abraham being a subject, now faith becomes a subject. That's another outline. Can I have two outlines? Well, you probably could, but if you're if you're it's like mountain climbing. If there are so many rivets to hang on to, you're gonna lose track. And so you want to keep focus on your emphasis. If you're just telling a story, then use the historical narrative outline. But if you want to emphasize a subject that is transcendent to the personality and to the story, then you might want to go to propositions outline and look for that subject and look for the substance. There's another way of outlining this, and you can outline this in view of your student and ask them, well, faith should be this way, more of an application. This is not close to commanding, but this is close to painting the situation of what faith could be, right? Rather than describing what Abraham's faith was on a present tense, you could say faith could be if you do it this way. For example, if you dare to trust God, you will be open to His voice. If you dare to trust God, you will be obey Him completely. If you dare to trust God, number three, you will make whatever sacrifice He requires. If you dare to trust God, you will trust Him to meet your need. You will remain alert for further instructions, and you will celebrate His faithfulness. And you notice how they're still related to each other, but the emphasis now is from just describing the subject. You brought it home to your listeners, and you're telling your listener that if you have this kind of faith, this could be you. This is what you will do. But then if you want to bring it home and make it more of an exhortation, an imperative, or a command, you're about to tell your students to do this, then you probably want to use this outline. You can say, if you really have faith, you will listen to God, and you will determine, and you will make whatever effort, you will expect God to meet your need, you will remain alert, and you will celebrate God's faithfulness. All of a sudden, now it becomes imperative, it becomes a command, it becomes a to-do list. And that's how you outline Genesis chapter 22. All right, well, I hope you have fun outlining, because outlining is a skill that you develop over time. And the more you are in the Word of God, the more you get used to understanding the writers. And if you read the Bible passage over and over, the more it becomes clear to you that the emphasis on a certain passage is this, and therefore the writer is going to take that theme in that passage and explode it in different structures. But it will depend on you, on what outline you will use, depending on the emphasis that you're going to do. Are you going to emphasize a story? Then you do historical. Are you going to emphasize a subject? Then you do a propositional. Are you going to emphasize is there an emphasis more of your listeners and what they can be? Then they make it more of application, or serendipitous statements, what they call it. But if you can also outline it as a task to do, as an imperative or a command, and so make it an exhortation. All right, well, that's how to outline it. Enjoy. Hopefully this week you've listened to your pastor and you've looked at the outline, and tell me, when we come together, tell me, what kind of outline did he use? I'm excited to hear from you. Aloha.